Hello, and welcome to I Am Dad Podcast with your fatherhood authority, Kenneth Braswell. 30 minutes of wisdom, information, resources, and nuggets to help you on your fatherhood journey. Or maybe you're just curious and want to hear some real talk about fatherhood, family, and the minds of men. Well, guess what? We got you too. Sit back, grab your pad and pen, and maybe even bring a little something to sip on. Enjoy 30 straight minutes of fatherhood, family, and fun with the Fatherhood Authority, Kenneth Braswell.
Welcome to I Am Dad Podcast. I'm your host, Kenneth Braswell. Thank you for joining me on another episode of provocative conversation around fatherhood, manhood, family, community. Whatever you're here for, we got it for you. And this is our fourth season. We're happy to be in our fourth season. The podcast continues to trend upward, which is always great. I mean, I can't go anywhere without someone saying, yo, I listened to the podcast, even though I don't see it showing up in the numbers. I don't know how people are watching it and I don't see it, but I just know that people are clocked in, whether it is through our podcast platforms or on YouTube, where people get to see the faces of the people that we interview. But thank you, because you could be doing something else with an hour of your time than listening to us talk about the most critical subject matters that relates to family and community. Today, I am honored to welcome Dr. Clinton Boyd Jr., a visionary leader and powerful advocate for Black fathers and families. As the Executive Director of Fathers, Families, and Healthy Communities and a researcher at Chaplain Hall, Dr. Boyd is at the forefront of shaping policies and programs that uplift Black fathers, strengthen families, and address systemic inequalities. His groundbreaking work bridges research, advocacy, and community action, driving meaningful change in juvenile justice, early childhood development, and family resilience. A Prevent Child Abuse America National Board member and a 0 to 3 academic fellow and a 2024 Aspen Institute Aspen Fellow. Dr. Boyd is recognized nationally for his transformative leadership. Beyond his accolades, he is a proud father of two, embodying the very principles he advocates for. So let's join him as he discusses his work, his journey, and his unwavering belief that Black fathers are essential assets to their families and communities. Let's bring him to the stage. How you doing, Doc?
I'm good, brother. Admittedly, as you were, reading my bio, I couldn't help but think, like, man, he's talking about me. I've come a long way over the short amount of time I've been toiling in this space, but I just also want to say that I'm, the latest link in the chain, and I think about brothers like yourself, Joe Jones, Ron Mincy, the Waldo Johnsons of the world, the ones that were really the pioneers in this space, as being the individuals who helped to lay the groundwork for somebody like myself to continue this legacy. So I just also want to say that I'm greatly and deeply appreciative for being here with you. I got a great deal of respect for you, and I'm looking forward to today's discussion.
Thank you so much, man. We are equally as proud of you. My heart swells when brothers like you come into the space, because I know that the legacy of this work will continue to move forward and be in great hands of people who are passionate about this, passionate about our families, passionate about our communities, and in this specific space around Black fathers and families, that that the advocates for this work will continue to surge in the spaces that allow us to become all that we have the potential to be. And that's always my thing. And right now, at this kind of seasoned age in my life, right? And so, not old, I'm seasoned. Like, this gray is just God's indicator, sprinkling a little salt on the black, on the pepper. And so, and it really shows how much he has marinated my life in the work that I've done. And so I appreciate you, and likewise, I'm always here for you, whatever you need, however you need it, whatever I can do to the best of my abilities and power to influence and do things for you. I'm only a cell phone or a phone call away. Dr. Boyd, we start off our podcast with a very interesting opening that's all on you, through a little story that you're going to tell. You could tell it however you want to tell it. It's for our audience to be able to know you a little something.
Mhm.
Tell us your daddy story.
Oh man, I don't think we have enough time for that. Because you all know Clinton Boyd Jr., but Clinton Boyd Sr.,
Mm,
he is, as I like to put it, somebody who's perfectly imperfect, right?
mm,
And so my father is someone who is really a child of the Jim Crow South. He was born and raised in Tutwiler, Webb, Mississippi, which is in the Delta. And one of the stories that he would often tell me about his childhood to always paint a very vivid picture for the type of childhood he had growing up is that Emmett Till's trial was at my father's grammar school. So he grew up against the backdrop of all things related to Emmett Till's death. And keep in mind, that was an incident that really sent shockwaves throughout the globe. And for many people, they consider that to be the starting point for what eventually became the civil rights movement, right?
mhm,
But again, according to my father, Emmett Till was just one tragic example of what would happen to black boys and black men during this very cruel and brutal period in U.S. history. As my pops would also often tell me, Junior, you had the South and then you had Mississippi to
mm,
really to really paint a very vivid picture around how entrenched the racism of the Mississippi South was in comparison to what you experienced throughout the entire Jim Crow South. But despite my father having those type of experiences, he was always a guy who had a deep, unyielding love for his children. And he always embraced this more community or communal notion of what it meant to be a father, which, as you know, is something that is prevalent within our communities. It's not about that rugged individualism. It's about not only being a positive example for the children that you've brought into the world biologically, but how do you also set a positive example for the many children you have an opportunity to influence by your positive character and the positive deeds that you brought out into the world through your daily actions. And so that's really something that my father has always instilled in me, not
mhm,
just through words, but also through deeds. My dad is somebody who's big on principles.
mhm,
And for him, it's like, um, I think about something that W.E.B. Du Bois once said in one of his writings. Children don't just learn from what you say, they learn from what you do. And
mhm,
so just trying to close that gap between what it is you profess and what it is you practice is something that my father has always modeled for me, and I'm deeply appreciative for having him in my life. Even though at times, you know,
You
I
could have
just
done without something.
yeah, but I mean, I wouldn't be here without my father, and that's not taking anything away from my mom at all. Like I love her deeply. I have a great deal of appreciation for the type of parent my mother is, but when I just think about my upbringing in inner city Chicago, and the type of environments I had to navigate to even be here with you today. I had the right type of father who was in a position to help me navigate the mean, tough streets of Chicago, especially in the sections that I grew up in, which weren't always welcoming to a young black boy. So,
Mm. Yeah, you described something that I've often wanted to write a book about. I just don't. I never thought I had the expertise to write it, and I never came up with the angle of a book. I've always wanted to do a book around the migration of Black manhood from the
mm,
South to the North.
mhm.
There's a nuance in that because as
Oh,
you
yeah.
described him, my stepfather, not my biological father, was from North Carolina, but my stepfather was from Glen Allen, Mississippi.
Hmm.
Right. And as you're talking, I'm hearing these similarities. And I often wonder how the manhood that was marinated in the deep South, as you described, there was the South, and then there was Mississippi, and then there was Georgia, right? And
Right,
so, and then there was Alabama,
right,
and
right.
right, and so all of them can say we they not like us.
Precisely. And that's not necessarily a badge of honor that one should be trying to wear, but that's what they would lean into because it was the time period in which our forefathers were forced to operate in.
Mhm,
And I would say that unfortunately, many of those negative wicked elements that define the South yesterday are the
mhm,
same wicked, evil elements that not only are confined to the South today, but that spirit has now expanded beyond the South to really grip the entire globe. So,
mhm.
yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And so his transition, um, Boyd Senior's transition was in Chicago. Mine's was in New York City. And so
Hmm.
we talking two sides of the same coin, right? With respect to when they got there. But I often wonder like what that manhood translated into coming from that back there. Cause I think that there were two paths that men took. As you described your dad, I'm looking at the contrast of my stepfather, who when he came to New York City, got involved in the movement, right? And the movement had to be financed, and they found ways to finance the movement that landed him in prison.
Hmm.
But he came out of prison, got his life or got his life right, settled, and ended up retiring from a steel company after 25 years as a vice president of international relations. And this is a guy that came from the deep south of Mississippi. And
Hmm.
so his manhood um, manifested itself out of this deep stuff that we're talking about. And I often wonder what made many of our fathers go one way as opposed to the other way. And then what did that look like as it related to family? Like, did they double down on family? Did family become just this kind of aside from whatever their mission was? Or was it something that they were engaged in as part of their escape, from the South?
Hmm.
And which leads me into my second thing I want you to talk about, because it is where you have landed, is somewhat where I've landed too. And that is a specific desire to figure out and provide solutions to the ills that impact specifically Black fathers. Talk about that journey and how you got there.
Yeah, well, it's really building on the story of my own biological father, right? So, something that I've been forced to really reconcile in the context of my professional work as it pertains to fatherhood and even my own personal journey as a father is this whole notion of what does it mean to father through pain?
Mhm,
Um, to be a black man in racist white America, you can't help but be in pain emotionally, physically, financially,
mm,
socially, and even spiritually. But even despite having the weight of that type of hardship being placed on your back, you still have to find ways to show up and be remarkably resilient to still carry yourself forward, carry your family forward, and for some of us, try to still be a beacon of hope and inspiration for the communities that we come from, who look to us for hope and inspiration. And
mm,
so, for myself, I had these personal conversations with you before, but I'm more than glad to bring them out into the open. I became a father at the age of 15. So I was 15 when my daughter was conceived, 16 when my daughter was born. And I often lead with the fact that I became a father at the age of 15 because from the point of conception, that's when I was forced to start doing the identity work around what was it going to mean for me to show up as a father for my unborn child at that time. What does this mean, excuse me, in terms of me being a committed, responsible partner and co-parent? Like again, all of these thoughts were swirling around my head from the time I found out my daughter was on her way into the world. But in hindsight, I was still 15. I was still a boy. So developmentally, there was only so much that I could do in order to fulfill those parental responsibilities associated with fatherhood. And so, luckily, and this is really God working and orchestrating in my life, he made sure that I had the right people around me who were able to step in and provide that type of support to me in ways that were going to allow me to still prioritize being a child, but also recognize that you are now entering into the realm of parenthood and adulthood prematurely. And
Mm-hmm.
so that African proverb, it takes a village to raise a child, was something that was on full display because my parents stepped up and made sure that, I was well taken care of. My daughter's maternal grandparents and her extended family, they stepped in and made sure that I was well taken care of. Close friends and their parents and grandparents, they stepped in to make sure that I was taken care of. And it was really this buffer that they created around me that allowed me to continue with my education,
Mm-hmm.
while also taking on the responsibilities associated with fatherhood and parenthood. And so by the time I, got to college, by the time I was graduating from college, I had an opportunity to transition into the workforce. And one of my first jobs was at a local nonprofit here in Chicago called Family Focus Lawndale.
Mm-hmm.
And it's called Family Focus Lawndale because it's in the North Lawndale community of Chicago. And the North Lawndale community of Chicago has its own unique history, especially as you think about the civil rights movement, because the North Lawndale community was the community that Dr. King and his family moved to during their short stint in Chicago around 1966 during the Chicago Freedom Movement when he was trying to bring awareness to the housing discrimination that blacks in particular were facing as we were trying to move out of the Bronzeville community and move into certain sections of Chicago that had historically been occupied by whites. So again, that was the community that I started to work in. But at this point, North Lawndale was about 98% black. Um, it had one of the highest incarceration rates in the state of Illinois. And if we're talking about mass incarceration, we're talking about primarily black men being the direct victims of this system. And so the program that I worked in at Family Focus Lawndale was called Mission Men. And Mission Men was basically a fatherhood program where we had a partnership with an organization called the Safer Foundation, which is this reentry organization. And so you had men who were returning home to North Lawndale,
Mm-hmm.
trying to get jobs, um, transitioning home from jail and prison, and they would join the Mission Men program. And so after every cohort of fathers we would work with, we had another set of fathers coming through our doors who had the exact same stories, the exact same issues, the exact same hardships. And it became immediately apparent to me that this isn't a conversation merely about personal responsibility. This is also a conversation about irresponsible policies and wicked systems that are hell bent on destroying the hope and the aspirations of black men who had so much to offer the world, but
Mm-hmm.
because they had passed through punitive systems throughout their life course, they rarely had an opportunity to showcase their God-given greatness. And as a result of them coming in contact with these systems, they were forced to deal with the collateral consequences of mass incarceration, which my work was trying to address. And so I'm like 21, 22, 23 years old, coming in contact with brothers who were in their 40s, 50s, 60s, who had been victims of the draconian war against drugs policies, the mandatory minimum sentencing and things of that nature, guys who had been gone away for like 10, 15, 20, 30 years. And so it was really in that moment where I decided I wanted to go off and study this issue, this topic more seriously, because what I was encountering in my professional life just really didn't align with what I felt were the root causes of the issue. And I've always been an inquisitive person, and I've always been a seeker of truth. And
Mm-hmm.
so I decided that I wanted to go further my education, and that eventually led me to Atlanta, Georgia, to start my PhD program. And I was there from like 2013 to 2019, and that was a story in and of itself. So I'll stop there because I'm sure you have more questions that you want to ask.
Yeah, no, Atlanta is a whole nother podcast. We gotta come back because
Yeah, yeah,
that's
yeah,
where I am. So
yeah.
I'm
That's where you're at now. So you
exploration the exploration that I've gone in the last 10 years in Atlanta, Georgia. Again, like I said earlier, there was the South, there was Mississippi, and then there is Georgia,
Mhm.
right? That has its own, impact on all the things that we're talking about. One of the things that two words you said a couple of times, and I just want to kind of land on that a little bit before we move on. You used the term both hope and resilience, and I often wonder in our community to what extent that particularly Black fathers and their families are losing both hope and resilience. When you see that, do you see the deterioration of those two things in our community?
Yeah, I would say that there's definitely a prevalence of despair that exists among the men that I've had an opportunity and the great fortune of working with. And a lot of that despair is really tied to the fact that until they've had an opportunity to engage with organizations that are truly committed to uplifting them, they feel as if nobody sees them. No one recognizes their worth to their children, to their families, and to their communities. And if you go throughout life feeling as if nobody values you as a commodity, but they see you rather as a liability to like the family, the community, and your children, at some point you're going to take on that mindset, and it's going to result in some self-defeating thoughts and behaviors emerging that may not work in that father's benefit. However, because I don't want to just stay on that very real point, I also recognize that for many of these brothers, when they do have an opportunity to come into a community with
Mm-hmm.
like-minded brothers who are committed to trying to change their lives for the better, that's when the hope is restored. That's
Mm-hmm.
when you have an opportunity to reach deep down within them and help them to recognize the gifts and the talents that God intentionally placed within them that have not had an opportunity to emerge to the surface and be utilized for the betterment of the communities that they're a part of. And so that's why I feel that the work that individuals like ourselves do is vitally important to restoring hope among our men. Because without us having these institutions, and this is a key point, Black men need to have access to institutions that authentically speak to them, right?
Absolutely. Mm-hmm.
We need our own organizations that will allow us to heal from all of the traumas we've experienced throughout our life course. But the essential ingredients need to be love, compassion, empathy,
Mhm.
hope, resilience. We have to help our brothers to recognize that the ways in which we've been living up until this point really isn't something that we should continue to strive for. We have to commit ourselves to self improvement. We have to commit ourselves to self transformation. And at the same time, we have to recognize that nobody is coming to save us, because if that was the case, the cavalry would have been shown up by now. And so, what does it mean for us to unite around a common purpose, to unite around a common cause that is connected to the precept or the notion or the idea of righteousness? This is something that
Mhm.
I've really been starting to drill down more on in just my own personal evolution as a person, as somebody who's growing closer to God and who is, really digging deep into the various books of God. This to me is the one thing that God always references in his scriptures. We have to commit ourselves to living and leading a righteous life. And he actually has a criteria that he expects us to follow in order to live and lead that righteous life. Because oftentimes, the things that we profess do not align with the things that we practice. And
Right.
so it's
Mhm.
one thing to read the books of God, but are you practicing the books of God? And I bring this up into the conversation because for so many of the fathers that I've worked with, that through line has really been like faith and spirituality. And if we're talking about Black fathers in particular, just historically, like we have always been deeply spiritual beings and individuals. And I think the time has come for us to do much more to incorporate that into our work in an intentional way, even if it means that we don't get funding from the traditional funding sources, because that's not something that they are willing to support. I think the time has come for us to like radically reimagine what does it mean for us to show up in this space.
The interesting thing about what you just said, you use the term profess that the things that we profess that we don't typically practice. I always say believe. The things that we believe we don't necessarily practice
Mhm.
because we're always trying to conform to the world,
Mm,
right? Because we're focused on where our money is coming from and who is going to support. I think that's a large piece of what's at the core of what's happening now in our society around these programs and things that are being taken, that was given to us. And I've had several conversations with several people, and in my conversations, I've said to them, if we as a people had been doing what we're supposed to been doing for our own upliftment over these 40 years, we would not need these things.
oh yeah.
And right. And so the question then becomes, when you're looking at those things, where are the singular? No, let's come back to that, because there's another piece that I want to lean in on as well. And that is everything that you just described puts a framework around the solution to get to where we're trying to get to.
Mhm.
But the mechanism that to which we come up with solutions is primarily through research. But what you just described is very difficult to quantify
Right.
in research, right? So it
Mhm.
never hits paper. And
Mhm.
so even when people might be thinking about what you described, they might not see it as a solution because they can't see it on paper. It's in
Mhm.
their heart and in their spirit, it's in what they believe, but because it's on paper, it doesn't translate in the practice. How do we get what you're describing into the stream of consciousness specifically on how we serve our community and do it in a way that we are unapologetic about doing it that way and not reliant on conforming to a process that tells you you're supposed to do it in a different way?
Yeah, that's a great question and an astute observation, because this is something that I've thought about a great deal as well, as somebody who's a trained scholar and social scientist who also sits in on a lot of conversations related to what is the gold standard of research, in terms of how do we bring about thoughtful solutions to some of the more vexing issues affecting Black men. And honestly, I just go back to what I, just shared. We need to have our own institutions.
Mm-hmm.
Institutions that are not just ours in name, but institutions that are ours because we control the financing around the institutions.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I think this has been an area where we have the greatest opportunity for growth, within our community, but it requires us to come together, um, and to be unified. And as you know, historically, that has been our downfall because our disunity has been exploited. And
Mm-hmm.
the extent to which we can find ways to bring together the community for the purpose of not just creating research based solutions to the problem, but also having a research approach that is not top down, but is actually ground up. So one of the areas of research that I primarily focus on in my own portfolio is known as like participatory action research. It's a different type of research methodology that allows us to work with community members to develop solutions to social problems,
Mm-hmm.
problems that they care a great deal about within their respective communities, but with centering the perspective, with centering the wisdom, with centering the hopes and aspirations of the community members. And you have those trained social scientists and scholars like myself who engage in the act of humility to work alongside members of the community to develop a different type of evidence base that
Okay.
will that we deem valuable, to creating the solutions. And once we have more research like that put forth and pumped out into the ethos, I think it'll be an opportunity for us to really challenge some of the status quo ways of conducting research within the world of research that tends to dictate and determine what is considered, again, the gold standard of doing research. What is the quote unquote evidence, right? This allows us to broaden that definition of evidence in a way that centers the perspective of the community members who are also thinking about the same thing that the Harvard trained, Yale trained, Princeton trained researchers, uh, you know, are studying within their respective portfolios. But in many cases, they study problems that, and this isn't the case for all of them, but for many of them, they study problems through a deficit based lens. They don't
Mm-hmm.
always recognize the communal wisdom that exists within the populations and the subpopulations that they are seeking to research. But by engaging in more participatory action research, and if we engage in that participatory action research within the confines and the context of our own institutions that we've created, that we financed, I think we will naturally be in a much better position to address many of the social ills afflicting our communities.
Mm-hmm. I think one of the challenges is in, like, I think that there needs to be a redefining of terminology in our spaces and in our work that oftentimes causes confusion in what it is we're really after. I'm tell you the word that
Hmm.
challenges me the most these days as I'm to your point. I think you and I are similar in the sense when I go into rooms, you and I find ourselves in the same rooms and we're in the room. We do more listening than talking because I
Right.
want to hear what you're saying, right? And I want to try to get a sense of, are you saying what you say you saying? Or are you saying what you want me to think you're saying? Or what is it that you're saying? And so I'm listening to terms, right? I'm listening and I'm like, okay, I know what I think you mean when you say that word, but I don't know if that's what you're trying to project that word to me. Community is the word that I struggle with today.
Hmm.
And the reason that I struggle with community today is because I think that we have lost our way on what community is, right?
Hmm.
If it's almost like the term friend, right? Or brother. Like I had this conversation with these guys the other day, and I was like, I am disenchanted right now with the word brother. I'm like, like when you call me your brother, I'm like, what does that mean?
Hmm.
Because true brotherhood is connected to commitment and engagement. And
Right.
just to call me brother, to say you're connected and you ain't really connected confuses the word for me. Same thing happens with community. Like community to me has been overdefined by society, right? Where community is who you work with, community is who follows you on social media, community is who you have minded thoughts with on community, where community has always been more about who you engage with and who you love,
Hmm.
right? And we are moving away from that. So when we say community, I'm often thinking like, who are you talking about when you say community? And as a people, when we say community, how are we defining that word?
Right.
Because men and women in the same room could say community and mean something totally different. I'm talking black men and black women can be in the same room, say community, and be saying it in two different spaces. When you're doing your work and kind of defining how you want people to receive literally what you're trying to articulate, do you have trouble sometimes with hoping that, as Chris Tucker would say, do you hear the words that are coming out of my mouth?
Right. 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 Yeah. No, I think that's another, great observation, and it definitely varies depending upon the audience that I'm addressing.
Mm,
And so, if I'm, for example, leading a program session with the fathers that we work with at Fathers, Families, and Healthy Communities.
mhm,
When I use the term brother to address them, I'm very clear and concise with them about what I mean when I say brother. When I address you as brother, I genuinely mean that I see you as my other self, right? So
mm,
the things that I want for myself, I want for you. Therefore, you're my brother. When I use the term community and community uplift or community building, I never gloss over the fact that when we use the term community, the base word in community is unity, meaning that
mm,
we need to be unified around a common cause. It doesn't mean that I'm advocating for uniformity. That's something that's
mm,
different from unity.
mm,
Unity means we can appreciate each other's subtle and not so subtle differences. We can acknowledge that there are things that you may do well that I may not do well, but there are things that I do exceedingly great that just may not be a part of your skill set. But if we're united around a common cause, and our common cause for unity is our shared belief and commitment for our love for our children, the upliftment of our families, and the betterment of our communities. Then what do we need to do collectively to move forward with our collective unified agenda? Now, again, that's when I'm talking to my brothers,
Mm,
right? In a program session. But if I'm in some of these other spaces where that term is thrown around more loosely by individuals who I know are not as deeply committed and or familiar with the type of communities that have helped to shape and define my life and are really at the hallmark of the work that I do in community, then to your point, I'm pushing for some additional clarity in those spaces.
mm,
Can you help me to better appreciate what you mean when you say community? Because I hear the word, but the context that you provided around the word does not align with my definition of community.
right,
And so, just to make sure that we're on the same page, and also more importantly for me, I took a pledge when I returned back to Chicago that I would never violate the oath that I made to my brothers to be a good shepherd of the flock while I sit in this seat. So in many cases when I'm in these spaces when with individuals who speak on the behalf of the community but do not represent the best interests of the community that I feel God has allowed me to advocate for, I
mhm,
feel as if it's my duty and my responsibility to challenge them diplomatically,
right,
respectfully, but also, and with intelligence, but also in a firm way to let them know that that's not just going to fly.
right,
Because again, we have to push for clarity and we also have to make sure that they recognize that the community in which they are trying to do work in is not always the type of community that they describe once they add context around those words that they use in that space. And so
mhm,
sometimes you really just have to challenge the quite frankly the racism that shows up in those spaces and places and let them know that hey, this community is actually
mhm,
accounted for,
mhm,
and they're accounted for because God has blessed me to show up in this space and engage in this dialogue with you to ensure um to help ensure that again they are being spoken about in a dignified fashion, not in a way that dehumanizes the communities that historically have been the victims of exploitation,
mhm.
genocide, discrimination, and racialization. And so I just try and do as much as I can while I'm in those spaces to give truth to power.
Yeah, when I was with the state of New York, um, in the beginning of me beginning to do specifically the fatherhood work, I was within my fatherhood program was within the New York State Child Support Enforcement Office. And the atmosphere in there was different. It ain't like it's different now. Even we talking 20 years ago. It
Yeah.
was it was a different space.
Hmm.
And I would be in there trying to do my fatherhood work, trying to infiltrate and trying to, help people on the outside navigate child support. And I used to come home and there was a couple of brothers that lived in and around where we lived and they knew what I did. And we would have these conversations and they would tell me about their cases and what was going on or cases of their friends or their family members or whatever. And I remember one night having a conversation with my wife and saying, oftentimes I go to work, I'm asking myself, like, yo, dude, like, what are you doing? Because I'm working every day, but what I'm doing doesn't seem to be penetrating down to the people that are living around me,
Hmm.
right? Which is my
Right, right,
which
right.
is my community.
Hmm.
And if I'm not doing the things that penetrate down, then I have to reassess what it is, I'm doing. If I'm going to impact the community that I'm trying to impact. When you think about Chicago, right? Because there's descriptors of New York, there are descriptors of, Atlanta, Baltimore, DC, LA. There's all kind of descriptors of these cities. What's the descriptor of today's Chicago?
Yeah. So, yeah, that's a loaded question because uh, on on one hand, again, depending on who you're talking to and what you see in the media, right? Chicago primarily is known for gun violence, right? It's known for community violence, but again, specifically gun violence. And I'm not in any way trying to trivialize the fact that any loss of life prematurely is something that's worthy of, uh, consideration. But as somebody who stays in Chicago, as somebody who lives in Chicago, like in the community, because I've made a conscious decision to live among my people, I also see so much more than these negative descriptors and labels that have come to define a city that has gave so much culture to the world, right?
Mhm.
And so for me, I see the beauty of my city. I see the hope. I see the resilience. I see the unshakable grit and determination. You gonna make a way out of no way, regardless of the cards that you've been dealt. And again, that takes me back to this whole idea of resiliency being a defining feature of the Black American experience.
Mhm.
But we also have to recognize that while on one hand resiliency should be considered an asset, it also says more about the society in which a group of people are residing in or staying in. Because why is it that we have to be remarkably resilient? Why
Mhm.
is it that we have to survive? Why could it not be the case that the societal conditions were created and established in such a way where everyone can flourish, where everyone can thrive? Because when I think of resiliency, I think about survival. Like, I think about a group of people who have come under incessant attack by systems and structures that are hell bent on keeping them down and perpetuating the discrimination and the hardship that has become a defining feature in their life. And I want to create systems and institutions and structures that allow people to just rise up into their God-given greatness, and everybody can just be, right? And so again, that's what I oftentimes find myself grappling with here in Chicago. It's like, on one hand, yes, you have to confront the immediate challenges and needs that are real for many of the community residents, especially the guys that I work with. And that is a topic of uh, personal safety,
Mhm.
interpersonal violence. But I want us to get to a point where we move beyond personal safety and we think about communal safety.
Gotcha.
Because to me, that's a different conversation. If
Mhm.
we're prioritizing communal safety, that first means that we are unified within our community, and any force that is trying to impose their will on what we collectively believe to be at odds with what we know to be in the best interest of our community, then we have to unite against those forces and protect what we have built and established within our community. But that
Mhm.
again means that we're unified. And so I think about a lot of the conversation that is taking place right now in response to a lot of companies and corporations and even government backing away from DEI initiatives, right?
Mhm.
And while it's unfortunate on one hand, if you're a true student of history, it's unsurprising, because historically within this country, whenever we've made racial progress, it's been followed by racist progress.
Mhm.
And I would like for us, honestly, as a community, to not think about, how do not only think about how do we boycott certain businesses that are still willing to double down on their commitment to DEI and support us, but I also want us to consider, what does it mean for us as a community to buy up?
Mm.
all of the vacant properties that are in our communities, right?
Okay.
Well, what does it mean for us to buy up our community, control the institutions within our community, finance the institutions in our community by leveraging the collective power of the black dollar?
Mm.
Individually, we are poor. Individually, compared to our white counterparts, we do not have the same level of wealth. But collectively, we do have the ability to marshal forward resources that will allow us to buy up properties, buildings, institution, and create institutions in our community that will allow us to suffice our own needs. And
Mhm.
so that's what I'm committed to for the foreseeable future. And I honestly believe that in order for us to receive the type of true liberation that we're after, we have to put forth more energy and more effort to doing for self and really leaning into that spirit of self help and self determination. Because again, just being a student of history, this system, this structure has not proven itself worthy of
Mm.
committing itself unapologetically
Mhm.
and consistently to our upliftment as a people. And so
Mhm.
we need to seize power in ways that will allow us to determine our own destiny.
Yeah. I forgot who was it called. I don't know if it was Langston Hughes. I don't remember who it was who said it's something about the system. A system will never work that's not built for you. Something I'm paraphrasing.
Right, 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 right.
The system wasn't built to work for you. Like,
Yeah.
why would you expect it to work? You're in the same space I am, which is, in wherever we land or whatever is taking place currently in our country, how are we responding proactively, not reactively, to maintain the same system that hasn't worked for us in the first place?
Mhm.
Right? How are we proactive in changing the paradigm in which we empower our communities, empower our families? So you're not content, you're not, waiting for anything to be given to you. And not to say that everyone who's gotten it has been given it, but for those who are relying on the giving piece of it, which is you owe it to me because I need it and you've always been giving it to me, that's not a path that we should be going down, regardless of what administration is in place.
Yeah.
Right. And so, man, I'm looking at the clock and I'm like, goodness, you and I could,
We
man, we
could
could
keep
chop
going
it up
and
for,
going.
yeah.
I have
But
to do
there is,
part two or something.
yeah, we got to do a part two. But there is one last space that I want to lean in, just a little bit um, before we close. And that is, as we are kind of looking at the programmatic work, right? And that is the actual work on the ground. Like, what is it that we should be thinking about in serving our communities so that we can build their capacity to do exactly what we're suggesting?
Hmm. Now, another great question. So, something I've been thinking about, especially since I've taken uh, on the responsibility of executive director at Fathers, Families, and Healthy Communities, is really learning more, like past this prologue, right? So just thinking about all of the many fatherhood organizations that have come and went, unfortunately.
Hmm.
I feel as if we have to think more intentionally about what does it mean for us to have a self-sustaining funding model that
Hmm.
will allow us to do the work in the community that we know needs to be done, but not necessarily be bound by the restrictions associated with some of the funders who typically fund our work.
Mm.
And a part of that conversation means that we can't have this overemphasis on programmatic services. Yes, the programmatic services are important, but we can't discount the need for that back office administrative support, those operational systems to also be built into our uh organizational infrastructure in a way that allows us to sustain the work that we aspire to do on the ground. And
Mhm.
so, again, I think that we have to get to a point where we start thinking much more intentionally about how do we create new funding streams for this work that is tied to more self-sustaining um, organizations being present not just today but also well into the future. And also, just thinking about programming specifically, if we're talking about Black fathers, there needs to be more of an emphasis on culturally relevant, culturally responsive programming integrated into our work, not just for the sake of educating folks about our history that they may not be privy to, but it's about what does it mean for you to learn about your history. If you know about the history of your people, then it brings about a certain degree of self-confidence. It boosts your self-esteem. It forces you to reassess how you're living your life. And unfortunately, for so many of the fathers that I've worked with, whenever I start talking to them about, you know, elements of our history that are strengths based, that are asset based, I can literally see the glimmer of hope light up in their eyes, and they become naturally inquisitive because you give a man power by giving him knowledge.
Mhm.
Period.
Right.
Like,
Yeah.
period. You give a man power by giving him knowledge. And if our men have been the victims of miseducation, then we can't necessarily expect them to be informed in such a way where they can really move forward and again become the masters of their own destiny. And so I think that we have to think much more intentionally about how do we incorporate culturally responsive, culturally relevant programming into our fatherhood work that allows our men to become more self confident and really take stock of their self worth in ways that will be deeply meaningful to them. And it will have a trickle down effect to their children, their families, and their communities.
Yeah. I'm going to say this and not so you can respond to it. We got to come back and pick this conversation
Yeah.
up from this point that I'm getting ready to drop right now. So I'm going to give you some time to think about this.
Okay.
And that is when we've done that before, Black Wall Street happened.
Right.
We got to learn from that,
Right.
right? Because what
Right.
we're suggesting is getting back to that.
Mm-hmm.
And we know what happened when that occurred because that gave a whole nother message to people that they
Right.
fought against. But we got to be in position when we do self-build. And I have always used the term, we need to really figure out a way to stimulate self-investment. How do we invest in ourselves
Mm-hmm.
on all angles? Work, money, resources, capital. How do we internally invest? Because ain't nobody really going to invest in you until you invest in yourself.
Right.
Right. And so all of these programs that we're talking about is really an investment in us without us investing in ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
And so we have to figure out, that's why a lot of this conversation that's going on right now is missing me from
Mm-hmm.
people who I'm seeing post things about what's happening in administration. And I'm looking at them say, but I ain't never see you support nothing.
Mm-hmm.
Why is this of concern? It
Right.
wasn't of concern to you before. Why is it of concern to you now? Why? Because it's clickbait,
Mm-hmm.
right? And that drives me. Man,
Yeah,
listen,
I can
I
tell.
have I have deleted probably 60 to 75 people off of my social media pages solely because they're regurgitating messages and images that are counter to what it is we need to be doing or need to be talking about. And we're grossly distracted.
Right.
And it is like, let's stick to the point right here. The point right here is that we're begging for something that's really not owed to us. we're begging for something that is our equal right to have, but we got to bring something to the table to be able to counter what we're seeing, and we're not doing that. We have not done that, and there's no plan to do that moving forward. So we always going to be right here where we are right now. What they say about insanity, that's doing the same thing over and over and over again and expecting a different result. What we're engaging in right now is the same mechanisms that we always engage in when things seems to press us up against the wall, and we get a little reprieve because people come in and they make it look like they're doing something for us. And then we find out after a while that they ain't really do nothing for us. We still in the same predicament that we were in before. But that's my soapbox. And so,
Yeah, it's a good
my,
one.
huh? You said it's a good one.
It's a good one. Just real quickly, I do just want to say one thing in response to the valid points that you just made. And this is something that I definitely want to drive home for your listening audience.
Mhm.
God of justice is on scene today. Just like
Mhm.
the weather.
Yeah.
If you recall the speech that I gave in DC,
Mhm. Yeah, we call that.
one of the things that I said at the conclusion of that speech is that the God of justice is on scene today, and all you have to do is pay close attention to the weather. And so when I think about what does it mean for our community going forward to have the level of protection that is required for us to withstand any form of backlash that can come in opposition to our community upliftment, we have to lean into the power associated with the God of justice that is on scene today. And for me, it comes back to living and leading a righteous life in the ways in which it is defined within the books, plural,
Mhm.
of
Mhm.
scripture. So
Mhm.
that's a conversation for a whole nother day, but that's the time that I'm on right now.
That's the time that we on right now.
Yeah.
I told somebody, I was like, I am unbothered, unmovable, and unconcerned right
Right.
now. That's where I am right now. And let's keep it moving. Dr. Boyd, tell people how they can get in touch with you, find out more about you, and support the work that you do.
Well, yeah. Again, I'm the executive director of Fathers, Families, and Healthy Communities. Feel free to reach out to us by viewing our website, www.fhc.org. Contact information is on the website. And again, brother, I really appreciate you for allowing me to grace your I Am Dead podcast. And I look forward to having another opportunity to share space and time with you again.
Yeah, we're gonna have to go a little deeper. We're gonna have to. There's some things that we left on the table. I have a bunch of notes as you was talking. I was writing things down, so I'm gonna put this paper to the side. I'm like, I gotta come back to that. But thank you as well. Appreciate everything that you are and everything that you bring to the space. And to my I Am Dad podcast listeners, you know how I like to leave you. Always be kind to others as you are kind to yourself, or you might find yourself by yourself. Always shoot high for your goals, because even if you miss, you'll be amongst the stars. And as my good friend and mentor Art Mitchell used to always say to me, Kenny, it's nice to be important, but it's much more important to be nice. Until next Sunday, God bless and peace out.
Thank you so much for taking the time to spend with us. You've been listening to I Am Dad podcast. We hope that you have been informed, encouraged you to think, or even inspired your heart for the love of dads. The conversation does not end here. Come back and join us next week. Same time, same place. Or you can continue the dialogue on our I Am Dad Facebook page. We also invite you to listen to past episodes, learn more about us, and keep up with special activities by visiting IamDadPodcast.com. That's IamDadPodcast.com. Until next time, I leave you with this reminder of manhood from 1 Corinthians chapter 13, verse 11. When I was a child, I spoke as a child. I understood as a child. I thought as a child. But when I became a man, I put away childish things. Because of this reminder, I will always understand that I am dad, period.